Multi-hazards, all about protecting communities. Season 2.
Hello, this is the Multi-Hazard Podcast, where we take a deep dive into issues in emergency management, climate change, adaptation, security, etc. It's all about protecting communities. And welcome, Vin Nelsen here. Today, guess what? I have no guest. I'm interviewing myself. So, yes, it's going to be a season premiere and also some insights into the different topics. So, dear listeners, remember, it's my tradition here on each and every Multi-Hazards episode to say a territorial acknowledgement. And this is out of deep respect for First Nations people on whose land I podcast here in the suburbs of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. So the text comes from Kwantlen Polytechnic University, or KPU. So here we go. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded, traditional, and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Quiquetlam peoples. These are the names of various First Nations groups around me here in Greater Vancouver, here on the west coast of Canada. Now, without further ado, let's get to the solo performance / monologue. All right, here I am. That is great. Don't need to use Zoom or Skype or anything else. Somebody can hack and send us weird messages. So, yeah, I'm really happy because this has been a wonderful season. It's been a marathon, basically, because this is episode, I don't know. I won't say it because it might have to change later on. But yeah, we're at the end of a season. I'm going to start season 2. Got a lot of great people lined up for season 2. But let's just take a moment, reflect on season 1 and what has happened. And, you know, not everybody, but many people here in Canada were watching a TV show. You've heard of it. GOT, Game of Thrones. And guess what? I watched it backwards. I know, weird, eh? And yeah, I just said, let's try something new. So I watched it backwards, and then I think I watched the last 2 seasons forwards. But it was kind of weird going backwards. And one reason I did that, I think the first episode of Game of Thrones just kind of seriously offended me when they pushed that kid out of the tower. It made me so angry I didn't want to watch anymore. But anyways, I went into, I don't know what it was, season 4 or something, and then I just watched it backwards to the beginning. It's kind of weird. It's like that movie Memento or other movies. Yeah, so let's do it backwards. Why not? So let's start this wrap up before we get to the season. Now, I did with Robert W. Gray. So that was episode 20. It was called Wildfires in a Changing Climate. And it was really informative. Like, Robert is like a scientist. They call him a fire ecologist, but he just knows everything about fire and wildfires. And I emailed him and I told him that, one thing I said, you did great. I need practice to sound more professional and less like a stuttering, shy person who doesn't know what they're doing. I'm working on it. Thinking on my feet during such a wide variety of interviews is often challenging, because if you look at all the topics that I did, I mean, wow. There is a wide variety, and it just keeps getting wider. So, but as they say, climate change requires all hands on deck, and I'm doing what I can, learning more each day. Now, here's a very interesting comment that I said. I don't know why, out of all the hazard topics, yours seems to give me pre-PTSD jitters. And then I mentioned it must be the lengthy Black Sunday documentary with Australian survivors I viewed on YouTube last summer. So yeah, it was this, I don't know, it was like an hour. And oh my goodness, there was this day, I think it was, 10 plus years ago. It's called Black Sunday in Australia. And just listening to the survivor stories, right? Oh my goodness. It just freaked the heck out of me. I don't think I slept that night. And it was in research for another project for this emergency management course I was taking. So anyways, I just said to Robert that I am so in awe. I said, that's why I'm so in awe of you being able to study all this, like all the wildfire stuff, with determination and little visible flinching. Hope I learn your secret. So I got to admit, it's a very interesting topic. And Robert W. Gray is a strong proponent. That's all, folks. That was Porky Pig. Imitation there. So Robert W. Gray, he's a real proponent for prescribed burning, which basically means burn stuff, right? Burn forests so that in the future it doesn't unpredictably come upon us, right? These forest fires. You burn it so that in the future fire has nowhere to go. So it makes sense, right? It's called prescribed burning. But anyways, when I get too much into reading about climate change and all the wildfires, it just kind of freaks me out. So, hey, what's that Jonas Brothers song? I'm only human, right? So, yeah. So let's get to the next one. I'm going backwards, just like in the way I watch Game of Thrones and the way that old movie Memento went. So here goes the next one. So I've got an episode. It's called Indigenous Perspectives on Adapting to Climate Change. And so it's with Carrie Ann Charles. And honestly, when I do these podcasts, I edit the MP3 a little bit, right? I've just stopped taking out the ums. I'm like, I just like to, it's kind of pure, And I know it's a bad attitude, right? Because if you're an artist, you should always be rebuffing your work, or you're a writer, you should always rewrite them, so many times. But I don't want to change the conversation too much, right? And I think I even left in a part where I cleared my throat. Oh, he cleared his throat. Amazing and terrible at the same time. So it was really a great podcast because honestly, I had an epiphany, I think, and I mentioned that in the podcast. I had an epiphany way back in 2008. Basically, I'd been forced to come back from Asia, from working there for several years because of a family tragedy. And I was like, what next, In my life, I need to go on a new so-called mission or something like that. And then I started finding out about First Nations issues. There was it's funny because there was a fellow on the radio yesterday and I said, hey, that's the guy who got me into First Nations issues. There's a guy named Bill Chu, and he's a retired engineer here in Vancouver. And I think he had an organization, Canadians for Reconciliation. So he deals with issues for Chinese Canadians here in Vancouver. And then he was dealing with a lot of First Nations issues. So I actually accompanied his group to a place outside of Pemberton, BC, just above Whistler. And I'm just trying to think, what's the name? Lilwat, I think, is the name of that First Nation. It's pretty huge. Anyways, and I met a lot of First Nations in Vancouver, and I did a lot of reading of history. Oh my goodness, lots and lots of history. And it wasn't easy because I remember way, way back in 1986 or something like that, I took a course at Simon Fraser University where I did my bachelor double major communication, which is media, and then French. So I did a BC history course, British Columbia, that's where I live. That's the province on the west coast of Canada, right above Washington State in the US. And it was like, we didn't really learn that much about First Nations. And in high school, elementary, not much, right? Because this is the 80s, remember. And then I read all this history, and it just shocked me to the core that, we settlers, Europeans, had been so, we can say, barbaric and cruel to First Nations people. Basically, you sail across the ocean, you make friends, basically, and you receive all this kind treatment by First Nations people, and then you start, setting up shop, and you're like, hey, we're taking over. And of course, it happened over many decades. You could even say a couple centuries, but it happened incrementally in waves. It happened in South America, Central America, the Caribbean with the Spanish, the Portuguese in Brazil, for example. It happened with of course, the biggest one was the British and the British Empire, but the French did it. The Belgians, is that how you say it? The Belgians went down to Congo and some other countries. Germans even, I think, tried a little bit. Italians did Eritrea, Ethiopia, some areas. So there was a lot of European colonization kind of streaming out of the continent of Europe. And a lot of it was based on, for example, the desire to get gold, because gold was kind of the be-all, end-all standard and source of riches back then. And a part of it was their religion, Christianity. They wanted to expand to the rest of the world. Another thing was resources, right? Oh, don't forget the Dutch, the Holland people. They went to South Africa. They went to Indonesia, Malaysia, right? They went to many places. British even went to Hong Kong. So we're dealing with all this kind of effects of imperialism even to this day. A lot of the things that you see in the news, they're because of all these hundreds of years of imperialism. So to go back to First Nations in Canada, and you can also include the Inuit in the north. And also there was these people who became like half First Nations, you could say, and then half European. They are called the Métis. So all these groups are oppressed, basically. Europeans come, and it's a long process, but basically take over, take away the land, put people on really small, bad land, and say, okay, here you go. Here's your little corner of the woods, and you set up shop here. And previously, First Nations had big areas to roam, so they had several villages based on the season. They would just travel from village to village and, do whatever. Go to one place, do fishing, go to another place, do berry picking, go to another place, go hunting. And they were more nomadic in many places. And then we were telling them, the white European settlers are like, hey, you gotta, stay in this crappy piece of land. And it is crappy. For example, here where I live in Vancouver, First Nations land, right? It's all on the Fraser River. And people are like, oh, great, they can get into their canoes and do some trading. Well, no, that's actually the worst land. It's like on mud flats. And whenever the Fraser River, like right now, it's about to flood maybe, like go over, say, 6 meters or maybe up to 7. The last big flood, I think, was 1971, and then there's another big flood in 1948. Well, they're on the little crappy land right beside the Fraser River, ready to flood. So they're going to be like first ones flooding. Yeah, I just want to say, when I say we, I'm kind of grouping myself in with the Europeans. Now, like, I'm of Norwegian ancestry on my dad's side. His parents came from Norway, basically, 100 years ago, a little bit over 100 years ago. And then my mom's side, basically, she has a grandpa came from Denmark. And then she has another set of grandparents. One was British and the Danish one married the British wife. And then on her other side, she has, it's a Scottish, I think. So both grandparents from Scotland. So that's my blood. I kind of identify more as Norwegian just because that's the most of my blood. And, Norway and Denmark, they were actually one country for a while. Norwegians kind of resent that. But anyways, yeah, it's kind of very similar culture. So I consider myself Scandinavian, Nordic, you can say Viking. Yeah, with a little, smattering of Scottish in there. Tiny bit of British. Okay. British Empire, don't identify with them. So, yeah, so we came in after the land was already settled, basically, and First Nations had been roped up and put into, I want not literal ropes, but they were just like, it's kind of like corralled into these little reserves all over Canada. And, don't forget the smallpox. Basically, Europeans were brought diseases, just like our COVID-19 pandemic now. But guess what? A lot of it was probably was, I know maybe and probably there are two different things, but there could be a lot of evidence that it was intentional, right? You give somebody a blanket, right? That was kind of a gift back then. Give somebody a blanket that had been wrapped around somebody with smallpox. You give it to the First Nations chief, and then he says, "Oh, thank you, a blanket." And then he spreads this disease, the smallpox or whatever disease it is. He gets it, and it spreads to the whole village. And then people spread it up the river system because that was their freeway back then. They'd canoe up the rivers and do trading. So yeah, the disease goes from the tip of Vancouver Island in British Columbia and goes all the way over to the mainland where I live outside of Vancouver, all up the Fraser River and all up the coast and up the different river systems. And there you go. You have actually caused basically a genocide of First Nations people. And I'm trying to think, the first wave, what was it, 1780, around there? And that wave actually had come up from the Spanish down in South America, and it traveled all the way up through Central America, Mexico, the whole West Coast, and boom, it killed off a lot of British Columbia area First Nations people. And then later on, I think there was another wave around the mid 1800s, so before the gold rush. Maybe it was the early ones, but it was like two waves where basically both times 80% of communities died, right? So I studied all this, everything, so around 2008, and it just shocked me to the core. I remember I was just like, oh my gosh. So yeah, I expressed a little bit of that in my interview with Carrie Ann Charles, and she had a lot to say, and she reminded me of many things because at that time, and I think up to around 2013, I took my family to many of these war canoe races, say outside of Chilliwack, Agassiz Mission. There's this place called Seabird Island, First Nation, I think. Well, anyways, I'd go there for their war canoe races. I'd go to powwows, which are usually in the summertime. I remember Fort Langley. I've been to one in West Vancouver. Been to one in Kwantlen Polytechnic University, the place that I told you about, KPU. So, and that was I think 2 years ago. Yeah, so I associated with First Nations people, talked to many of them, tried to learn a little bit of the local language, Halkomelem, and didn't really get very far. But yeah, and then got busy with family, and I really couldn't do a lot of this anymore, right? Kind of stuck at home these last few years and worried more about, how am I going to make money? That triangle where your needs are on the bottom, and then, I don't know why I always forget the name of that fellow who, that triangle thing, right? And then people who've met all their needs are on the top of the triangle. So struggling at the bottom of the triangle, you can't really deal with other issues. So yeah, I really appreciate that interview with Carrie Ann Charles, and I think it's a really good way to kind of go, well, this is not the last one of the season. I think there's another one I'm interviewing tonight. We're interviewing 3 people from Bangladesh about climate change refugees. So, but I don't really know the content as much there because it hasn't happened. So yeah, thanks to Carrie Ann Charles, and I hope I interview her again. It was really an enjoyable interview. Going back from that, we have, and I'm just basically telling you a little bit like what happened. So then episode 17 was emergency management with the Red Dragon, interview with Paul Edmonds, and he is an emergency manager about 5 hours from me. And that's actually where my Danish great-grandfather had immigrated to, is Penticton, which is one of the main cities of Okanagan, in the Okanagan Valley, about 5 hours straight east of Vancouver and what we call the Lower Mainland, Greater Vancouver here. And yeah, that was very eye-opening too, because some ideas I'm going to share with you a little bit later in this episode. Some ideas from Paul Edmonds basically have been percolating in my mind about what needs to improve in emergency management here where I live and across Canada and maybe in other countries. So that was very eye-opening to hear Paul's experience from Wales, UK. And he said, they have a very strong culture. They have their own language, Welsh, and red dragon is the symbol there in Wales. So that's why he used that as the symbol of his company and the name of his company. So that was a really, really great interview. Then in episode 16, we had COVID-19 pandemic planning for businesses, interview with Regina Phelps. Now this was kind of unbelievable because she's in the middle of what's happening here in the beginning of July. Tomorrow's going to be America's birthday, 4th of July, Independence Day. We had our Canada Day, which basically was nothing but maybe some virtual celebrations on the 1st of July. And it's kind of funny. It's really weird. So most of the provinces have Canada Day. Quebec, guess what their July 1st is? It's like moving day. I don't even think they celebrate Canada Day. I'm not sure about that. But I went to Montreal on this day, and it was like, that's when everybody moves. They have 1-year leases for their rentals. It's kind of funny. It's kind of a slap in the face to the rest of Canada. But yay, Quebec, slap us. Woo! Anyways, because I identify that with them. I studied a lot about Quebec in university and speak French, etc. So I like those guys, yeah. There's this, in Canadian history, the history, the British colonists beat out the French colonists in a war. So Quebec basically became just like an island and separated from Mother France. So yeah, anyway, Canadian history. So that was really enjoyable hearing Regina Phelps, and scary because the night before I talked to her, and she's a crisis management expert. She's done pandemic planning for years. She knows a lot. But the night before, I listened to this ABC, I watched this video on YouTube, and it was like, my goodness sake, all these places, these states in the U.S. that were trying to reopen, actually, COVID-19 is going crazy there, and the hospitals are filling up, and all these, what do they call them? Governors there in the state where, they were talking about reopening for so long, and then now it's like, they're backtracking on their plans and even making people wear masks. And this is in the same places where people are like, no, you're not going to make me wear a mask. It's against my manhood, It's like, I want to die. Really? It's against your manhood, saving your own bloody life? What, you think you're so sexy, you want all the ladies and gay men or bi people to be looking at you with a sexual attraction, your attractive nose and your attractive chin and lips, men? I guess some ladies are anti-mask too. There was supposedly this one woman in Florida, she was on the news, and she was like, this is against God. This is a conspiracy to kill us all. These masks, they cut off your breathing. And I'm like, I don't disagree with you on that, because when I'm wearing my ninja mask, yeah, it cuts off my breathing a little bit. It's like, I don't like to keep it on for very long. But the other things, I don't know. Wear your masks, people. Wear your masks when you're in that situation. So it was really great. Regina had some ideas for companies to have different phases of planning for the pandemic and how to keep your workers working. So it was really enjoyable. Episode 15 with Alex Valaroso. That was about gender in disasters and emergency management. That was really interesting too, because she was talking about so many ideas about women are in different roles often and get affected differently in disasters, and how does that play in and into emergency management, and then also when disasters happen, including this one of COVID-19, the domestic violence goes up, right? So people beating on each other, usually the husband beating on the wife, but could be beating the kids or whatever. Somebody could be beating grandma or grandpa, elder abuse happening. So a lot of bad things could happen during disasters that are more social or as a reaction to the disaster. So Alex Valeroso, she knows all about that, and she was enlightening us about this. So I really enjoyed that. Alex is great. And then we had episode 14, Smart Energy Communities and Climate Adaptation, with Eddie Oldfield, and he's way out there in New Brunswick, right? The other side of Canada, which is actually doing what they call a bubble between the different maritime or Atlantic provinces in Canada, and they're going to allow some travel in there because they're kind of like separating themselves from the rest of Canada, because over there, Ontario and Quebec, they've been like the hotspots for COVID-19 cases and deaths. So Maritimes is kind of, I won't say cut off. Yeah, in a way, they're cut off, like transportation-wise. Like there's not the movement happening between Maritimes and then, say, the next over is Quebec. And they're protecting themselves. So anyways, Eddie was out of there, and he gave us a lot of interesting ideas about smart energy implemented in communities and how we can adapt to climate change. So then we had episode 13, Earthquakes, Disaster Management Education, and Protecting Communities, interview with Dr. Borchak Basbu Erkan. And she was coming from Coventry University. So Coventry University, that's way over in England. And apparently it's the first and one of the best British universities that has some master's and bachelor programs for emergency management. So that was very enlightening. And she is an expert. Dr. Basbu Erkan is an expert from Turkey. So she knows all the situation, and she's really specializes in earthquakes. So she's been through a lot of recovery projects, and she's studied and researched, put out papers, peer reviewed, and it's been a great career. So she was very enlightening. Then in episode 14, Youth Climate Activism and Sustainable Futures. It was really a privilege to have somebody who is not a PhD, who doesn't have 20 years experience, but Akhilesh Anilkumar, he's actually a student in Australia. He's studying cybersecurity, but he's stuck in lockdown in Kerala, the south part of India, and he's been starting organizations related to climate activism and to basically help people stop using plastic, because he gave us this really interesting story about after the Kerala floods. I think it was it last year or a year before? It's been flooding, I think, every year there. And, they had a bunch of youth and other people with big garbage bags, and there was plastic, he said, all over the place, strewn all over the forest. He said animals were even eating it, and they were just filling up bags and bags of garbage of all this plastic that's strewn everywhere. And he said it's like single-use plastic. You just drink your whatever, your some people call it pop or soda pop, your a carbonated beverage, and then there you go. You throw it away. And then later, the flood comes and it's in the forest, and you've got some birds or some other squirrels or something chomping on that plastic, saying, good plastic. Delish. So that's, Akhilesh Anilkumar, and he's actually pumping out a lot of podcasts himself with some other people. And what is it called? Bring Back Green. Yes, his organization. And then we had episode 11, Flood Mapping, Glacier Hazards, and Artificial Intelligence, interviewing David Bigelow. Now, he's near me. He's actually in Vancouver with Minerva Intelligence. And it was a great show because he's talking about how artificial intelligence can be used to collect all existing maps for potential flood areas or areas that have flooded, and then, can kind of churn out some results saying that, hey, these are some new maps based on all of the different studies and research from before. And he's also an expert in glaciers and how glaciers during their melting time, they can actually cause like floods and outbursts. And then we had episode 10, Adapting to Our Changing Climate, interview with Dr. Stuart Cohen. And he's also in Vancouver, near me. And he was working, I think it was with Environment and Climate Change Canada for decades in Vancouver office. And so his specialty was climate change adaptation. So he talked about, in general, what needs to be done. And he also did a project in Okanagan, where I tell you my Danish great-grandpa emigrated to. So that's a similar area to Paul Edmonds, the emergency management consultant. So yeah, Dr. Stuart Cohen, that was a really nice and kind of long, but really, really insightful interview. Actually, a lot of my interviews are pretty long. It takes forever, by the way, to do the study guide. I try to make up questions for like every important thing that the guests are saying, and I tell you, it takes so long to do that. It's like the lengthiest part of the process, but I really enjoy it. I learn a lot. And I told my family and friends, I said, actually, I took 60 plus courses, graduate level, undergraduate level, professional development level between, say, May 2018 and December 2019. And guess what? What I'm doing now with these podcasts, I'm actually learning probably way more. And this is like real stuff straight from the horse's mouth, as they say, straight from the horse's mouth, from the people who are really in the field or really in this academic sphere, academia they call it, and they're really, a lot of them are doing hands-on stuff or have done it. So it's really fresh information. So episode 9, Climate Leviathan and Potential Futures, interview with Dr. Joel Wainwright. Now, he wrote this book called Climate Leviathan with Jeff Mann, who's a professor, Dr. Jeff Mann, at Simon Fraser University, where I had done my bachelor. So I managed to get a hold of Joel, and he did this short interview. And then later in the podcast episode, I actually did a summary. And it's because this idea really fascinates me. Because these two professors are looking into the future and saying, hey, what's going to happen, with all these different extreme weather events that are happening, increasing in magnitude, that means they hit harder, and frequency, they happen more and more. And as my multi-hazards podcast kind of theme is that you can get hazards happening one at a time. So we call that consecutively, but you can also get them happening simultaneously, and that means at the same time, and they kind of like bump into each other. So it's like COVID-19. You got to social distance. You got to get ventilators and what they call PPE, personal protective equipment for hospitals. But then you got to evacuate people for, say, a building fire or a flood or a landslide. So you got 2 or 3 or more different disasters that can affect each other. And not just disasters. It could be a hack coming from some rogue foreign state or something like that. Yeah. So that was a really interesting thing. And they talk about, I think it was 4 different scenarios. So the best one, of course, is Climate X, which is not really defined that stringently, but that's about basically grassroots, democratic, worldwide movement and working on adapting to climate change and, of course, mitigation too. And it's more a people's movement, right? And they also said that indigenous voices should be paramount, right? They should, indigenous peoples must be listened to, and they listen to nature. So we need to listen to nature too, and everybody listen to them because they have really good solutions. But the other kind of bad and negative, the other 3, one is basically a left-wing government, Maoist, that basically says, okay, no more capitalism, and we're going to control everything. So authoritarian. So that's called Climate Mao. And then there's one called, I'm just trying to think here. There's another one that's basically green capitalism. It's like, we're going to solve this. So this kind of neoliberal thing that we've been doing, and we're going to, try to solve it together. And that's not really left wing or right wing. It's kind of centralist. And yeah, we're going to kind of play both sides. And I can't even remember if this is like, one world government authoritarian, or this is more like individualistic. The other one is like a right wing, basically fascist. It's sort of like the counterpart to the Maoist one, but it's a right wing fascist one. I'm trying to remember, is that one basically nationalist? I think that one's nationalist, where nobody works together. Yeah, and then the sort of the green capitalism one is, they do work together, but it's based on capitalism. So the right-wing one is also based on capitalism, but it's not working together. Sort of what's going on right now, right? With all these populist movements. So anyways, Climate Leviathan, very, very interesting look in the future. I really believe we need to look at the future, and we need to kind of visualize where we're headed and different scenarios. And then we had episode 8, Bangladesh's Disaster Risk Reduction, DRR. And that was an interview with Dr. Idris Alam. And it was very, very interesting. A little bit tough for me to have these interviews with that section of the world, because the window of time is very narrow. And so typically, like my episode tonight, interviewing people from Bangladesh, or actually Dr. Idris Alam, he was in United Arab Emirates, I think. Was it Abu Dhabi or one of those countries? And yeah, that part of the world, I have to like interview at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. And then over there, it's like morning. So they're interviewing at 9 a.m. So... but it works, people are willing to do it. It's great. And I really love the people from Bangladesh, and they seem to be really kind of cutting edge, actually. So in disaster risk reduction, so Dr. Alam was just talking about how Bangladesh has handled all these cyclones and floods and landslides, and the resilience of the people. Just a note about resilience. It basically means what? There's two kind of ideas here in resilience or resilient. One is tough, strong, you can endure. And the other idea of resilience is if something happens to you, you can heal quickly, you can recover quickly, and you can, they could say, bounce back better or build back better. I didn't like this word in the beginning. I'm like, oh my God, everybody's resilient. It's kind of like this happy, positive thinking where you're kind of denying the problem. Sort of like what some leaders are doing with COVID-19. They're like, problem? What problem? Things are getting better. While everything, of course, is getting worse. So, but now I'm kind of warming up to this idea of resilient, because, I think of an elastic band that's flexible and it doesn't break. But elastic bands do break, don't they? But anyways, yeah, resilient. So that was about Bangladesh. And then actually I had 2 interviews with Phil Gursky. He's basically a terrorism expert. He specializes in Islamicist, is that how you say it? Terrorism. So basically Islam or Muslims gone rogue, and they're, taking parts of the Quran and interpreting it their way that basically kill everybody who's not Muslim. So I didn't really want him to talk only about Islam, and he was like really cool because he had written a book that did talk about Islam, but it also had chapters, I think, on Christianity and then on Buddhism, Hinduism, so different religions. So I did parts 1 and 2 with him. I did episode 4 and 7. So basically, episode 4 was called Can Religion Sometimes Be a Hazard? That's a question, of course. And then we did part 2, and I really enjoy that because, I could ask and we could talk about religion. And let me give a disclaimer. Is this disclaimer? Basically, exposure. letting the cat out of the bag, coming out of the closet. I'm not religious. Okay, I'll just let everybody know. I myself, I'm not a religious person. I had a lot of religious input in my youth and my younger years, but right now, last few years, I don't have a religion, right? I'm more like I believe in nature. I'm really into nature and science, of course. I believe science is kind of one of the best interpreters of nature. And I really relate also to First Nations, indigenous ideas about nature and the world and everything. But I love to talk about religion, and even more so now that I'm not buying into one myself. I love to talk about religion, and I try to find common ground with people from different religions. I just love it, right? But, when they start using religious ideas to not social distance and to, lick their shrines because, I'm not getting COVID-19, whoever's out there in the other world, right? Because most religions, they not only believe in this physical world, but they have other worlds, right? Where there are gods and devils and angels and dead people, kind of ghosts or spirits floating around. I don't know if they have the spirits of people who haven't been born yet. That would be interesting to ask people. But yeah, they call it it's the metaphysical ideas. It's another plane of existence, right? And anyways, it's nice to find somebody who's willing to talk about that, because in Canada, where I was raised, it's kind of we were raised as don't talk about religion or politics, right? It's funny because now, the last 10 years, that's all we talk about is religion and politics. Did you watch that movie? Did you see that show? Did you hear that concert? No way, man. Let's talk about politics and religion. Yeah, let's fight. Twitter. Yeah. That's funny. Anyway, I'll talk later, maybe if I have a chance, about social media. And then we got episode 6, Multi-Hazards in a Risky World. And that was a great interview with Dr. John Clegg. And he is a retired professor out of Simon Fraser University, where I'd done my degree. And I was kind of I wish I had had him as a professor. I think he came as I left the university there, or there was maybe 1 year overlap, but I wasn't taking any geography courses that time. But he's fantastic, and he has a lot of ideas about geohazards, and nowadays Dr. John Clegg is actually thinking more about the social aspect of geohazards and also politics, and I really like where he's going with these things. I wish he kind of write a book about it, or go on CBC or something to talk more about the social aspect. And so that's a great interview. I'd like to get him in again. It's great. I'd like to get everybody here in again eventually. And then we have episode 5, City Planning and Climate Risk. I might have had a different title. Can't remember. Anyways, interview with Christine Callahoo. She's also in Vancouver. She's a city planner, and she's really into what they call natural assets, or natural, it's called asset management. And at first I thought, asset management? What are you talking about? I kept thinking about banks, right? They're going to manage the assets of people who are rich. But no, this is more like a community, kind of listing out all of the benefits, the things that are beneficial in the community, and actually putting a price tag on them, and then kind of making a list. So that was interesting. So Christine Callahoo. And then we had episode 4, I told you, with Phil Gursky, the terrorism expert. And then episode 3, we had tornadoes and communicating disaster risk. So that's the interview with Dr. Justin Sharp, and he's actually from United Kingdom. And I don't even know. I should email him and say, where are you, Justin? Because he's supposed to be working, I think, what is it, Alabama or something. It's what the what is this? The National Oceanographic CC. NOAA, isn't it? Oceanic and atmospheric. Anyway, he's in one of these places, and it's I think US has a few of them. And he's supposed to be working in this big place researching social aspects of disasters, especially tornadoes. And because of COVID-19 right now in the United States, and before it was really bad in the United Kingdom. So he was in lockdown and quarantine, so he had to do everything virtually. So that was a really awesome talk with Dr. Sharp, and he is sharp. I mean, he had a lot to say about tornadoes and about communities protecting, and also he's an expert in disaster risk reduction education. So he had made things for youth, and he was studying like different ways we can communicate about risks and dangers and how to protect ourselves. Very interesting. And then actually, I think it was like my first interview was episode 2, volcanoes, landslides, and artificial intelligence. Was that the title actually? And that was interview with Dr. Gio Roberti. Now this is a really interesting story because I saw some Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, online articles about this volcano that's just near one of our top ski mountains here called Whistler, and Blackcomb, of course. So the village is called Whistler. Anyways, just and that's even the place where I told you there's like Pemberton, this little town, and then there was Mount Curie First Nation. That's the name of it. They're like Lil Wat Nation, but it's called Mount Curie. So anyways, maybe an hour's drive from there. I don't know what it was like, 10, 20. It's 20k kilometers, I think, east of there. There's a Mount Meager. It's a volcano, and basically there's a bunch of glaciers on top, and they could go at any time, right? These glaciers, I mean, they're melting because of climate change, and then all that ice on top, it starts melting, and then the rock and the earth underneath is like holding this volcano together. It can like rupture and then open, and then maybe cause gases to be released or lava to flow, or that thing could blow. So that's very interesting. And then Dr. Gio Roberti is also working with Dave Bigelow at Minerva Intelligence there in Vancouver. So very, very interesting place. I'd love to visit it one day. So, and then I did my first podcast. Is basically what was it? It's like saying multi-hazards is out of the gates, and I was telling everybody my vision and where I want to head with this. And so there you go. There's basically a season wrap summary. Yeah. And very, very, very interesting time. And I think it's changed me more than my listeners and even my guests. It's changed me. I've really changed. Not just COVID-19 pandemic and all this stuff that's going on, but I've changed. Just hearing everything. It's better than going to graduate school, learning at the feet of these people. It's just fantastic. So, anyways, I guess I'm running out of steam here. And that's my little spiel. A season summary, and a few ideas. And maybe you're going to see some of these ideas being fleshed out in my episode interviews with people. So let's get to my disclaimer. I added to the end of each and every episode. This podcast is meant to be educational, and it does not try to offer legal, medical, or other specific advice unless otherwise noted. Also, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that the host, that's me, or guests are part of. So, here as I finish this episode, thanks to all of you precious listeners for tuning in today. So this is Vin Nelsen, thanking you so much, wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. So cheers to you all of you, each and every one of you. Peace out.